Prime Minister Kieran Rudd and his New Zealand counterpart are discussing moves towards a single economic market between the two countries during official bilateral talks in Sydney. The New Zealand PM John Key says he's particularly keen to achieve less red tape for tourists and business people travelling across the Tasman. Sky News chief political reporter Kieran Gilbert spoke to Mr Key earlier today, and he began by asking how New Zealand is weathering the global economic crisis.
I mean, we've been in recession now for 3 quarters, albeit a very shallow recession, basically contraction of 0.1%, 0.2% in that order. The challenge, I think, for New Zealand is how we can come out of this recession and actually use the time to redefine our economy so that we're travelling faster, hopefully, than a lot of other countries when the recession finally abates. Now, we are very dependent on the Australian economy. About a quarter of our exports go to Australia. So the fact that Australia is still strong and the fact that the Australasian banking system, which dominates New Zealand banks, gives us a real advantage. But you know, the challenging times, and it's hard to know whether we're at the bottom of them yet.
Well, you, in your response, in your initial policies, have cut taxes, individual taxes and business taxes, cut red tape for business, but there hasn't been a cash splash, a series of handouts like we've seen here. Explain the logic behind your approach.
Yeah, it's a slightly different approach probably to Australia and what we've seen in the rest of the world, although only marginally. So we've been describing it as a rolling mall of initiatives. In other words, we think that the recession will run for a period of time. At least 2009 looks like it'll be very challenging. And we want to be able to respond to those different events as they occur so that we can keep confidence going in the economy. Now, one of the reasons we haven't had a sort of big bang approach is that because we campaigned on issues like personal tax cuts, one of which starts on April 1, 2009, in essence, a lot of those things have been pre-announced. So we've gone back and looked at the total level of our stimulus, and our package looks like we're in about the top 5 in the world. So we're still very stimulatory, but a lot of it's been pre-announced. It feels a little bit different to, say, the $42 billion package that Kieran Rudd announced over here.
It looks more in line with what our coalition, our opposition's been arguing for, and that is the tax cuts, less spending, no cash splash. Their argument is that tax cuts change people's behaviour and spending behaviour over the longer term and change patterns as opposed to a cash splash, which is a one-off. Do you agree with the Malcolm Turnbull and coalition argument on that?
Well, look, I don't know, it depends on the circumstances really. I mean, there's some argument that says if you give people a cheque up front, they will actually go and spend that. And it depends who's receiving the cash. Certainly lower income Australians, or in your case, or lower income New Zealanders, are more likely to spend. Higher up the order, they may repay debt. I actually think either is wholly appropriate. Depends on the circumstances of the individual. But I guess where we come from is we just say, look, the private sector economy is a huge part of our economy. Putting more cash in the pockets of New Zealanders is important. But actually in both countries' case, Australia and New Zealand, probably the thing that's most likely to stimulate the consumer will actually be the reduction in interest rates. That's going to have a tremendous impact on what's going into the wallets of Australians or New Zealanders as those much lower interest rates flow through to much lower debt servicing costs for their homes and businesses.
You have said that you don't want to saddle the next generation with debt. Yeah. That's something that Malcolm Turnbull has been critical of Kieran Rudd over. So there's a similarity on that front, and you've been praised for that approach from various quarters, including the Wall Street Journal Asia, which pointed to that. So on that front, you're on a common footing with the Liberals.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's not for me really to critique what's happening in Australia. It would be inappropriate for me to do so. All I can say from a New Zealand point of view is we just need to recognise we go into the recession in a slightly worse financial position than Australia. I mean, our gross debt levels are still very low. They're 19% of GDP. Net debt's virtually zero. So of the OECD 30 countries, we're in the third best position, if you like, third least indebted balance sheet. But Australia is stronger. Effectively it's had no debt, and while New Zealand is on negative outlook for S&P ratings, Australia is not. So we're treating a slightly finer balance here between spending money to stimulate the economy, and on the other side of the coin, making sure we either don't precipitate a downgrade, or, as I've said, saddle future generations with debt, which ultimately has to be paid back.
And you'll be holding your talks today with Prime Minister Rudd. Obviously, economic matters will dominate and moves towards a single economic market. How important is that, and can it take the relationship much further, given, of course, the free trade agreement's been in place for decades now?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think if you look at CER, it's been around for basically 26 years, and it is the most comprehensive trade document that's been ever developed and adhered to. So it's very comprehensive. But the move towards a single economic market is an attempt to really integrate the investment protocols and also ultimately the behind-the-border issues that both countries face. Now, from New Zealand's point of view, as I said earlier, you're a very large part of our economy. Huge amount of our tourists that come to New Zealand, a million of them come from Australia, so dominate those stats. You're a quarter of all of our exports. You're a huge amount of inbound foreign direct investment in New Zealand. So, look, New Zealand is dependent on Australia and a strong Australian economy. The more we can do to make that integration more seamless, the better, while still preserving, obviously, the national rights that both countries want. And I think there is further integration that can take place. There's a number of issues that we're going to work on. And climate change will be one that we'll be having quite a close look at. If you think about the concept of CER and a single economic market, it seems to sort of run counter to that for each country to be developing a different response to climate change, because it runs the risk where you've got multinationals investing on both sides of the Tasman, getting different investment signals if we get it too far out of line with each other.
So you're talking about synchronising tax systems, and I've seen as well suggestions that the flights from New Zealand to Australia could be treated as domestic flights. Is that something that's realistic?
For us, that's something that's very important, and I raised that with Kevin last night, and I think it's something that the Australians would value as well. So the way that would work is if you went through immigration, either on, let's say, the Australian end for a New Zealand-bound flight, you would effectively clear customs and biosecurity and the likes at the Australian end, land at a domestic terminal in New Zealand, get off and walk through, pick up your bags and go to the hotel, and vice versa. Now, there are cost savings of that, but also huge time advantages. And as I said, a million tourists at this stage coming on, basically on each side of the Tasman, got to be a huge advantage. And if the Europeans can do it, I can't believe that it's going to take New Zealand or Australia 6 years, which is the current predictions, to sort that out. It's a pretty simple thing.
You know, if there are that many linkages, and if this single economic market does eventuate, as we're anticipating, what's the politics of this like in New Zealand? I mean, will people be seeing this as New Zealand as just another state?
Rushing to join the Federation? Probably not. We had that chance back in 1901 or whatever it was. There's always a rivalry between New Zealand and Australia, and that manifests itself most profoundly on the sporting field, and it's a great rivalry. But there's also a great sense of comradeship, and you saw that with the outpouring of support for New Zealanders for the Australians that were lost in the bushfires. Pretty much every sphere, whether it's trade, cultural, economic, you sort of name it, sporting, social, people-to-people links, there's massive links between New Zealand and Australia. So I think that competitive spirit and that rivalry will always remain, but it's one of those debates where, do you believe the sum of the parts is greater than the individual pieces? I do, and I think the medium-term challenge for both countries is actually to be fully integrated into Asia, where I'm convinced Asia will be the massive growth engine over the next 20 years. Europe's got serious issues, both in its banking systems, its labour markets and the likes. The United States will recover, but Asia's going to be the growth engine, and for both of us, we've got to be focused on that target.
Mr. Key, I want to ask you a couple of other questions on a few other different issues. Executive pay has become a real issue here in Australia in the last week or so, with a couple of companies closing down. Parallel to that, some reports of very high executive wages. Do you have any concerns about executive pay and any ideas on how the government might move towards reining them in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've got to get balance here. So, I mean, firstly, you're running very large corporations over here, and you compete for that human capital on a global basis. I mean, quite a number of the CEOs that were around the table last night that Kevin Rudd had kindly arranged, major corporations, very few of them, Australian-born nationals. Now, you've attracted that capital and that human capital, and you need them to succeed. So there has to be a recognition that you compete in a borderless world. On the other side of the coin, these sort of obscene pay packets that you've seen out of Wall Street, which have led to a culture of greed and ultimately the demise of Wall Street because there's been far too much leverage with a system which has been fundamentally flawed, needs to be kept in check. So I think there'll always...
Do you have any ideas on that? Have you had any sort of thoughts on how you do that? Malcolm Turnbull suggests that shareholders have binding votes.
Yeah, I mean that's one way of doing it. I mean ultimately the best model was always aligning the performance of the company to the remuneration of the chief executive and the management team. And I think that it'll be a debate that'll never go away, because in reality there'll always be these pretty much telephone numbers paid out for chief executives for big corporations. But on the other side of the coin, we need to put that in perspective and say these are also chief executives that have enormous responsibility. The headcount that they employ, the hundreds of thousands of Australians at times, and we do need to make sure that they make the right decisions. Now, there's always got to be balance.
Just finally, there's been a tradition of New Zealand Prime Ministers and Australian Prime Ministers not always getting on that well on a personal level. But you said you were at Kirribilli House last night, met Mr Rudd. Do you get on with him?
Extremely well, actually. The funny thing is, often when the politicians come from the different side of the political fence, they actually strengthens the relationship rather than weakens it. It's counterintuitive, I know, but it's often the case. In Kevin's case, he has gone out of his way to show a lot of kindness and support for me. He was the first leader on the phone after I won the election. He's invited me over here for a state visit. He made a personal effort to introduce me to other leaders I didn't know when I went to APEC soon after I was sworn into the job. We're on the phone to each other reasonably regularly. We had an hour and a half together just on our own without the officials at Kirribilli House, and our wives had dinner last night. So, it's a good relationship, and it's a sense of his commitment to New Zealand. And I think to give John Howard some credit, it's a continuation of the decade of leadership that John Howard showed, and the sense that New Zealand is important to Australia, and it's important that together we work on trying to solve the issues in our region, particularly in the Pacific where there are significant issues.